All right, we can go ahead and get started. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today, Dr. John Koeppe. For those of you attending in person, we've got the overhead microphones unmuted. So when it comes time for you to ask questions, raise your hand. You can say it out loud, and everyone on Zoom will be able to hear. For those of you attending on Zoom, please make your questions in the chat. I will read them out loud for Dr. Patty to answer. So again, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today, Dr. John Patty, who's an associate professor here with us in the division of GIM. John did not give me very much material in terms of introduction, but unfortunately we worked together closely over the last 2 years, and so I'm going to make up my own. John did his undergrad in medical school at CU, residency at Utah, and fellowship in infectious diseases here at the University of Colorado. He joined the division of GIM back in 2011. And really, the way I got to know John was my first 2 years here at the institution. We both researched at the same time in resident clinic, and we're on the same team in the institute's internal medicine clinic as well. And John is just really one of the most empathetic, caring, lifelong learners that I've encountered. The kind of person that I really want to take care of a family member. And so I'm just more than excited for him to talk to us today about vaccine safety. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Steve, for that very kind introduction. All right, so today I'm going to talk about vaccine safety. I'm probably already for the top line. I think it's a relevant topic. I don't want to be too political, but for the political environment, different today's topic, but I'll certainly be different as well. So let's go ahead and get started. We should have plenty of time for questions during the talk. Try not to speed up when I'm talking, but very good to do.
I heard you received feedback that the audio is poor, so I'm going to make an adjustment here. Sorry, Dr.
Please let us know if that sounds better. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. All right. So again, we're talking about vaccine safety. My hope is to avoid too much politics, but obviously politics are part of the reason for this topic today. So let's go ahead and just get started. So no financial disclosures. I did use some AI from open evidence in some of my literature searches. I was trained, like probably most of you, that vaccines are safe and effective. And while I think that's the truth, I've certainly not reviewed everything that's been written, and that certainly could have affected my literature searches. And as you'll see, our case patient day is a little bit contrived and made up, but hopefully useful. All right, so goals. Be familiar with vaccine safety issues that have been raised in the medical literature. Nothing is 100% safe, including vaccines. So be familiar with concerns that have been raised and the research that's been done. And then be familiar with the evidence for and against these concerns. The last goal would be to address these concerns when it arises with patients. That may be the hardest one to achieve. I gave this talk in Estes, or I've updated it, but similar talk, and one of the people came up and said, it's almost at an emotional level that people respond to vaccines. It's been said that humans aren't the least instinctual of all animals. We're actually the most instinctual, and I think by that, it's meant that we're the only species that could look at a clinical trial and draw conclusions about the results. But more often than not, we sort of respond with what our gut, what our instinct says. If you didn't see the Grand Rounds on September 16 with Dr. Bernard, Amy Bernard, it's worth checking out. She talks about conveying information to patients. So with that, we'll go ahead and get into the meat of the talk. So let's start by just acknowledging some concerns that people have had about vaccines. So there have been elements in vaccines, namely mercury and aluminum. In high enough concentrations, these can be neurotoxins. It's also worth noting that as the number of routine childhood vaccines have increased, other diseases have too. Certainly that doesn't prove cause and effect. But if we start with the year I was born, 1967, there were vaccines against six infections: diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, polio, measles, and we were still vaccinating against smallpox at that time. Fast forward to 2024, we don't vaccinate against smallpox anymore, thankfully. That's been eradicated, but we're now up to 18 vaccines. So the number of vaccines has clearly increased in that time. Vaccines try to give us the immunity we would get from actually having an infection without the morbidity and mortality. And just as the immunity we get from an infection can sometimes cause problems, occasionally that can happen with vaccines. And as we seek to prevent diseases that cause less global disease, the balance of risk and benefit does get a little narrower. So if we think about smallpox, I extrapolated that number 4 to 5 million per year from a article that estimated in the 20th century, so between 1900 and 1978, when it was eradicated, probably 400 million people around the world died from it. So thinking about just what an amazing achievement the smallpox vaccine was, and I don't think I'm exaggerating saying hundreds of millions of lives have since been saved by that vaccine. Measles, not quite as deadly, but still killed probably 2 million people around the world every year before the vaccine. And then fast forward to RSV, a very good vaccine, but because it causes less disease worldwide, any small risk associated with it is, by comparison, going to be greater. All right, so let's talk. So the outline, I want to talk about mercury, aluminum, things that have been included in vaccines. Other vaccine components that can sound kind of scary, they're fine. RNA vaccines, autoimmunity, the idea of immune overload that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has raised concerns about, the concerns about autism, and then that will lead us to discussion of measles. So let's start with our case. 55-year-old male has essential tremor. He's due for a Tdap and COVID vaccine. He says, "Doc, I'm concerned about the mercury content of vaccines. I don't need any more damage to my nervous system." All right, so first question. The mercury-based preservative thiomersal or thimerosal continues to be used in many vaccines in the US. True or false? False. Yeah, false. So this is a thimerosal or thiomersal is a mercury-based preservative that has been used in vaccines and is still used in vaccines in many parts of the world. In the early 2000s, due to an abundance of caution, it was eliminated from the vast majority of vaccines. The one place it has continued to be used is in the multi-dose flu vaccine vial, multi-dose flu vaccine. Jumping ahead into a little bit of politics, as you know, the ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, those members were fired by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. The new committee, one of the first things they did was discontinue one formulation of flu vaccine, and that's this one. It's the multi-dose vial that contains small doses of the preservative thiomersal. If that's all they change, I'm not terribly upset by that. At Anschutz, we've been using single-dose vials, so this hasn't even been, so this won't affect anything at Anschutz. I don't know about other clinics. The amount of mercury we get in our diet is considerably more than we get in vaccines. Now, some people who raise concerns about this say, yeah, but you're giving this to children whose immune systems are developing. So, but even there, even a small child, the amount of mercury is quite small. And the amount in the diet would still be more. Trials have looked at this, and it's a bit of a noisy slide. And these trials looked at all sorts of neurologic outcomes. If it's in black, it means these neurologic outcomes were more common in kids who got the mercury-based vaccines. If it's in green, it means these things were less common in kids who got the mercury-based vaccines. And as you can see, there's as much green as there is black. I didn't include a lot of endpoints because most of the endpoints were no. But so this has been shown not to cause any neurological at the very low doses. At the same time, I'm not opposed to getting rid of it if it doesn't need to be there. But all right. So you reassure the patient there's no mercury in either the COVID or Tdap vaccines that he might be getting. So he says, yeah, but what about aluminum? That's a neurotoxin too. So aluminum salts continue to be used as adjuvants in many vaccines in the US. True or false? True, yeah. So how did we get to putting aluminum in vaccines and thinking and using it as an adjuvant? So this goes back to some veterinary medicine in the 1920s. So Gaston Ramon was a veterinarian who noticed when he was vaccinating horses with the tetanus diphtheria toxoid, if they got abscesses, which I suspect were more just local vaccine reactions, they seem to have higher anti-sera. Knowing how difficult it is to measure titers today, I'm not sure how they measured it in the 1920s, but that was his observation, that if they had a local reaction, they had more better immune response. And so it was thought to be an adjuvant. So they tried different things to sort of boost the immune response, breadcrumbs, tapioca flour, agar, all sorts of things. And they found that if they kind of had more of a local reaction, there was a better immune response. Similarly, Alexander Glennie was using aluminum salts to purify diphtheria toxoids, giving to guinea pigs. And he noticed that when it was detoxified with aluminum salts, he got a better immune response. So it was decided that aluminum could be an effective adjuvant, and aluminum salts have been used in various vaccines since the 1930s. And aluminum continues to be used in a number of our vaccines. So the Tdap vaccine would be one that has the aluminum in it. Hep A, Hep B, the older Hep B, the Engerix, not the newer Heplisop, Haemophilus influenza B, the HPV vaccine, meningococcal B, and pneumococcal. So a lot of vaccines continue to use small amounts of aluminum as an adjuvant. And an adjuvant, again, is just there to boost the immune response. So why the concern? So aluminum can be a neurotoxin in high enough doses. This was seen in some older dialysis machines where aluminum was used as a phosphate binder. And that's not the case anymore. But aluminum in high enough doses, it's fair to acknowledge, can be a neurotoxin. Now, again, just similar with mercury, we get far more aluminum in our diet than we do through vaccines. But once again, one of the concerns is you're giving these to kids whose nervous systems are still developing. But we still get far more mercury in our diet. So lifetime exposure might be up to 7.5 milligrams. We get far more of that in our diet each year. But again, the concern is in kids. So when I put this talk together for the first time, I could not find a single cohort study like there was for mercury. And this just came out this October, published in June, out in October. So this was a cohort study of over 1.2 million children in Denmark. And they were looked at no aluminum exposure from vaccines, and then they measured at 1 milligram increments through the first aluminum exposure for the first 2 years of life. And then they were followed through age 5 or loss to follow-up or death. So one critique someone who is still concerned about aluminum might say is, well, what about after age 5? Could adverse effects still occur? But follow till age 5. And the news here is very good. This is a forest plot, these are the hazard ratios. So 1 would mean no difference. Greater than 1 would mean more likely to have these things with the aluminum exposure. Less than 1, and that's where most of them actually fall, is less likely to have these things when exposed to the aluminum vaccines. And the only ones that reach statistical significance are saying there's less likely with the aluminum vaccine. So very reassuring that aluminum is not causing any neuro diseases in the vaccines. However, it occurred to me at my sort of 20,000 foot understanding of the immune system, our immune system is designed to recognize organic molecules, self versus non-self. So why the heck would aluminum be much of an immune stimulant? So I found all the articles I could find that these are all phase 1 and 2 that compared the immune response with aluminum and without aluminum in the vaccine at the same dose of the vaccine. And what you can see, the immune response, for the most part, really wasn't improved much. There were 3 studies that showed maybe some benefit. 1 was worse. There were more local reactions. So this left me a little unconvinced about the benefit of aluminum. And then after I put this together, I realized I downloaded this article and promptly forgot it under other stuff on my desk, that did a formal meta-analysis looking at this question. They found 102 trials. The meta-analysis was somewhat complicated by different studies using different immune assays. But what they found was very similar. Non-serious adverse events, kind of like the original observation, local reactions maybe boost the immune response. They did find that. But they didn't really find any evidence of immune boosting with the aluminum. So I'm definitely a member of the pro-vaccine community, although I disagree maybe with some that aluminum is a great adjuvant, although I don't think it's causing any significant harm. So you reassure the patient that the amount of aluminum vaccines, the Tdap would have a small amount of aluminum, is very small and less than he gets in the diet each year. Yeah, but there's other stuff in vaccines, formaldehyde, antibiotics. I don't want that in my system. So this is a billboard that was in New Zealand near the off-ramp to a hospital. It wasn't up long after some complaints, but it shows a father who is concerned about what else might be in vaccines for his son. All right, so there are a few other adjuvants, and they can sound kind of scary. MS-59 sounds like a gang. It's not. It's an oil and water emulsion. It uses a compound called squalene. It sounds very scary. It's not. It's a precursor to cholesterol. We all make it. Essentially, every animal does. We get it from sharks, which may be a little environmentally uncool. I couldn't find a great reason for this other than at a marine biology website, they said it's very easy to purify from shark liver. So that may be a little uncool, but it should be safe. We also use a citric acid buffer, polysorbate 80, which is commonly used in food, and sorbitan trioleate, again, commonly used in food. So if you're anti-food preservatives and food additives, again, this might scare you, but they should be quite safe. ASO3 is used in some pandemic flu vaccines, again, uses squalene, vitamin E, and polysorbate 80. So unless you're really avoiding any food additives, these should be quite safe. And then a couple other adjuvants, and these make a lot of sense to me, is the one used in the newer hepatitis B vaccine, the Heplisab. So this cytosine phosphogluanosine is a motif seen in bacterial pathogens. And without making this into an immunology talk, part of how our immune system works is antigen-presenting cells, pathogens bind to toll-like receptors, and that stimulates the immune response. So this vaccine is taking advantage of this. It's taking something to bind to a toll-like receptor on an antigen-presenting cell to boost the immune response. And you can see in the Heplisab B compared to the high dose of the older hepatitis B vaccine, we get a much better immune response with this adjuvant than we do with the just aluminum-based adjuvant. And then two other adjuvants that also make some sense using detoxified lipopolysaccharide. One of those is used in the HPV vaccine, another in the Shingrix vaccine. And of course, lipopolysaccharide can cause lots of immune stimulation. So that's probably why the shingles vaccine does have a lot of side effects. But again, should be quite safe and is using kind of the natural mechanism of the immune system to activate. All right, so other things in vaccines. Vaccines are complex, so of course there's going to be other things. So in some egg-based vaccines, antibiotics are used. These are generally taken out in subsequent steps. They generally use vaccines or antibiotics, excuse me, that we aren't normally exposed to, so we aren't likely to have allergy to, like neomycin, polymyxin B, streptomycin, gentamicin. Formaldehyde is used to detoxify the diphtheria toxate, so it is used in some vaccines. I did not know this until I put this talk together. We all produce formaldehyde in our body as part of very biologic processes, and even a small baby would produce more formaldehyde naturally than what might be left in any vaccine. And again, it's generally removed in the manufacturing process. And then sucrose, amino acids, MSG. Again, if you're opposed to any sort of food additive, that might sound scary, but should be quite safe. So vaccines are quite complex and other things are used in them. That's, however, true of almost everything in our life. So this very loving father also has some very lovely tattoo artwork. And tattoos, provided your tattoo artist uses a sterile needle, is quite safe, it seems. But are they complex and do they contain lots of chemicals that sound a little scary, including mercury? Sure. So vaccines are no different than so many things in our life that are complex, all of which should be safe. All right. So you reassure the patient that there should be no formaldehyde or antibiotics or other harmful ingredients in the Tdap and COVID vaccines. You reassure him that there are other ingredients in vaccines. They are common in our diet and daily products and are very safe. Yeah, but I don't know. I don't want my genetic code altered by an RNA vaccine. I don't want cancer. mRNA from mRNA can be incorporated into our DNA. True, false, in theory it can, but false, yeah. So, in theory, it is possible. I did not, again, things I did not know until I put this talk together. Apparently, there are some enzymes in our cells that can act like a reverse transcriptase that could make the RNA into a double-stranded DNA, and we do have enzymes that could, in theory, act like an integrase. There's no evidence that this can happen. It is worth noting, one of my patients was quite just indignant that they had the gall to do this. The messenger RNA is actually modified in these vaccines. RNA is a very unstable molecule. One of the many things I was wrong about during the pandemic. I didn't think they'd get these vaccines to work. They did. And one of the ways they did it is to modify the RNA so it's just a little bit more stable. It's still unstable. That's why we had to keep them at such cold temperatures, and you couldn't leave them at room temperature for long. But it was modified. So even with these modifications, it remains an unstable molecule. And in most cases, it's undetectable by day 14. And so there was one study in vitro that suggested there could be some incorporation. All other studies have simply said, no, this can't. So there should be no risk of this happening. So, all right. So you reassure the patient that RNA and DNA are very different. But DNA is incredibly stable. You can get it from mammoths who died thousands of years ago. RNA is very unstable. Yeah, but what about things like lupus and autoimmune disease? I don't want that. And one more disclosure, where this is a real patient, I would have bailed on trying to convince him to get vaccines a long time ago. But for today's talk, we'll carry on. So autoimmunity is a small but real risk. We think most autoimmune conditions occur through molecular mimicry. In other words, I had group A strep infection 6 months ago, and through just bad luck, antigens on my mitral valve are similar enough to the immune responses I got to the group A strep infection. So because we're getting very similar immune responses from a vaccine, it's not surprising that autoimmunity can occasionally occur. So the question then is, are we more likely to get autoimmunity from infection or vaccination? And it does look like we're more likely to get it from infection. So Guillain-Barré associated with the flu vaccine, less than 1 in 100,000 compared to infection, maybe as much as a little more than 1 in 100,000. So probably a little more likely to get it from the flu infection than the vaccine. Same thing with shingles vaccination versus infection. And then measles, acute disseminating encephalomyelitis, very, very rare with the vaccine, can occasionally happen more likely with the infection. So while autoimmunity can occur with vaccines, it appears you're much more likely to get it from infection than from vaccine. And then this was a study done during the COVID, kind of at the height of the COVID, when COVID was causing lots of bad diseases, and basically comparing how likely were you to get some of these conditions, many of which likely had an autoimmune basis, from vaccination versus infection. And where it's bolded, it's more likely. And you can see that herpes zoster myocarditis was associated with the vaccine, but was 4 times more likely from infection, and down the list, all things that many of which were probably, at least in part, immune mediated, were more likely with infection. So autoimmunity. Vaccines activate the immune system and can, in rare cases, lead to autoimmunity. This is true of vaccines, of infections that vaccines can prevent, and data suggests, I would argue somewhat limited, but the data we have would suggest autoimmunity is more likely from infection than from vaccine. So he says, but I need my immune system to fight infection. RFK Jr. says we're overloading our immune system with all these vaccines. I mean, I think that guy knows what he's talking about. This is a concern RFK Jr. has raised, that the number of vaccines we give children against 18 different pathogens, and in series, may be overstimulating our immune system, and that could lead to autoimmunity or other problems. So this one, while autoimmunity through molecular mimicry, I think, is a small but real risk, this, I think, is just false. And I say this for several reasons. One, it's estimated based on how many gene rearrangements B and T cell receptors can undergo, that we should be able to respond to a billion to potentially 100 billion different antigens. So we're not going to overwhelm that with 18 childhood vaccines or vaccines against 18 pathogens. The second is many of the things we vaccinate against are infections we would get in the absence of a vaccine. So before 1957, pretty much everybody got measles. Not quite as true of mumps and rubella, but still very, very, very common. Most of us in this room probably had chicken pox. Now we have vaccines for these. So, and if immune titers mean anything, you generally have higher titers from infection than vaccine. So if anything, I don't think we're overstimulating vaccine. And then lastly, nothing to do with vaccines, but public sanitation. So through most of human history, we got our water from lakes and streams, quite lovely, but probably not the safest drinking water. And then when we moved into cities, there was still no public sanitation, and the absence of sewer systems, streets probably served as waste disposal sites for many of these early cities. As we developed, many cities had ritual baths for ritual purification, but in the absence of public sanitation, probably did more to spread disease than purify, although maybe at a spiritual level. But so public sanitation has clearly decreased our immune exposure. And as we talk about diseases that have increased in our lifetime, or conditions that have increased, allergies is one of them. And one of the theories there is the hygiene hypothesis, that parts of our immune system are simply understimulated because of public hygiene or public sanitation. So I do not think we're overstimulating our immune system with our vaccines. Even if we add more to the schedule, we are not overstimulating our immune system. This has been raised, and by people who said it more articulately, Eleanor Comfort raised this in a email back and forth with Dr. Nichols, and I hope I don't misquote her. Please chime in if she's on, and I do. But could offering more vaccines kind of lead to people kind of getting overwhelmed by vaccines? I think we've all seen this with COVID vaccines, where even our patients who generally say yes to all our preventive measures have said no to additional COVID vaccines. And this, I think, and I don't think we want to not recommend vaccines because of this, but I do think some vaccines are more important than others. I would consider the MMR much more important than the RSV and the hepatitis B vaccines, at least in my monogamous 50-somethings. And so the closest I can come to a solution for this would be shared decision-making is always the right answer, but my shared decision-making with, say, COVID and flu is I recommend you get these vaccines. With hepatitis B, I do stop and say, you know, it's a new recommendation. Your risk is, depending upon who the patient is, your risk is probably pretty low. It's transmitted tainted blood or blood supply is quite safe. Intravenous drug use, they don't use it. And if they're in a monogamous relationship, I discuss all that before I say, do you want the vaccine? So that's the closest I have to a solution for what I think is going on with this. So immune overload. You discussed that while vaccines activate the immune system, they are very, very, very unlikely to overwhelm our immune system. You discussed our immune system may actually be understimulated due to public sanitation. So he says, yeah, but I've always been a little weird. I think I may have had autism as a kid that no one diagnosed. I don't want a vaccine making that worse. So how did we get to the concern that vaccines may cause autism? So this was a study published by Andrew Wakefield, was the lead author, or multiple authors, published in The Lancet, so a very reputable journal in 1998. It's a case series of 12 children presenting with new onset behavioral symptoms consistent with autism. 8 had recently gotten the MMR vaccine, 1 had recently had measles infection, and 1 had recently had otitis media. It was subsequently retracted in 2010 after studies showed no association with autism, and he was actually found to have altered the data, guilty of fraud. There's a great quote that I think is quite true. It's not related to this, but science is at once the most questioning and skeptical of activities, and also the most trusting. It is intensely skeptical about the possibility of error, but totally trusting about the possibility of fraud. I think most of us would look at this and say, a case series of 12 patients, I'm not going to change my practices based on that. But most of us, me included, would trust that it was done honestly and there wasn't fraud. In this case, there were both. So there's other studies. These are the ones, there are some studies that looked at onset of the vaccine and autism. These are the studies that I found that looked at vaccine versus no vaccine. And if the odds ratio is less than 1, you're less likely to have autism if you got the vaccine. If the odds ratio is greater than 1, you're more likely. And you can see that almost all the odds ratios are actually less than 1. The study by Jane, 2015, the fourth one down, looked at the question, maybe there's a biological predisposition, and then the vaccine sort of sets it off. So they looked at patients or children who had a sibling with autism, and they still found really no relationship with the vaccine and autism. All right. So one flawed and subsequently fraudulent study that has been withdrawn of 12 children led to the fear that vaccines, specifically MMR, could cause autism. Multiple studies have since shown no association. But it is worth noting that autism has increased dramatically. So in 2000, it was 1 in 150. Now it's 1 in 36. Few things about that. I'm not an autism expert, but it's worth noting autism was first described in 1943, and it was first added to the DSM in 1980. So our patient would have been born 10 years before it was even part of the DSM. And I asked 5 people, 3 psychiatrists, 1 psychologist, and a pediatrician who has worked with a lot of kids with behavioral issues, kind of what their thoughts on this were. No one thought this was a true increase in the neurobehavioral disorder of autism. 2 thought there probably was some true increase in the neurobehavioral disorder. They all thought that increased diagnosis, increased awareness, TikTok, other things were leading it. 3 of the 5 thought that was the entire explanation. So you reassure the patient there's no evidence vaccines cause autism. You share with him that he is entirely possible that were he born today, he might get diagnosed with autism, but that vaccines don't cause us. And so he said, thanks you, and says he doesn't want any vaccines today. So this leads us to the measles outbreak. So as of last Friday, the CDC is still updating this every Friday. There's just under 1,600 cases, and this is still ongoing. It isn't quite as the surge it was, but when I gave this talk in June, there were just under 1,200. So we've had another 300 or so cases since June. So this is not over. About 12% of individuals end up being hospitalization. There were 3 deaths early on. We haven't had any more since then, thankfully. And this is almost, I think, due to under vaccination. So this started in Gaines County. Our goal for the MMR is 95% vaccination. Texas is just under that. Gaines County is a little over 80%. And then of the 3 school districts in Gaines County, one of them was barely 50%, maybe a little under 50% vaccination rate. So very, 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 very likely due to under vaccination. And so why are we seeing this with measles and mumps and rubella? And it's probably just because measles, as you all know, is just so crazily infectious. So measles R0, or transmission number, that's the number in a totally non-immune population. If I'm that first index patient, how many people will I transmit it to? A lot of things affect that, of course. If I'm a hermit, I may not transmit to anybody. If I go clubbing, I'll probably transmit it to more. But it's estimated with measles, the replication rate is 12 to 18, which is crazy. If you compare that to, we all know what happened with SARS-CoV-2. That is a transmission of about 3. So it's just kind of mind-boggling to me. I suspect there's more cases we haven't seen, but really an incredibly infectious disease, transmissible disease. And one study estimated if we current rates of 88 to 96%, we could see, close to 900,000 cases over the next 25 years. So really, really important vaccine. All right, so immunity, this has come up a lot in clinic. Most of you probably already know this, but born before 1957, you're considered immune. Patients sometimes still ask to be checked, and I've checked them if they ask. But born before 1957, you're considered immune. documentation of two doses in SV documentation. And it's worth noting there was a period in the 1960s where there was the live attenuated, which we use now, and a killed vaccine, and the killed vaccine was found to be ineffective. So some people may have got the vaccine during that time and not provided any immunity. And then it was combined with mumps in 1971. And then it wasn't until 1989 that it became a two-shot series. So a lot of people could fall in that category of under vaccination. The CDC does consider serology an acceptable form of immunity. So some patients have just out of concern asked to get the MMR vaccine, who probably are low risk or maybe already immune. So could we run out of the vaccine if we vaccinate too many of these adults? So as of now, what I could find is probably not. Two companies, Merck and GlaxoSmithKline, make the MMR vaccine, and we appear to have adequate vaccine supply. So someone wants it, it seems okay to give it. Now, that said, vaccines are not big money makers, and there's also often government funding to support the making of vaccines. You've probably all heard $500 million grant for the development of mRNA flu vaccines was withdrawn. Could further cuts in vaccines happen? I suppose it could. But for right now, we appear to be doing okay with our vaccine supply. All right, so because MMR is this has also come up in clinic, a live attenuated, there should be D there, attenuated vaccine, its use in immunocompromised persons is absolutely contraindicated. True, false? Well, absolutely is kind of a strong word. So probably C. This was a study done in pediatric transplant patients, solid organ transplant patients. So 281 children who had most undergone liver, a few liver, kidney, and a few just kidney transplant. And then they were vaccinated against two live attenuated vaccines we give to children, the varicella vaccine and then the MMR. The varicella vaccine, and most were on, at the time of vaccination, on what this study calls low to medium immunosuppression, listed there. Only 2%, 5 of 217 getting the varicella vaccine developed any reaction. 3 ended up getting either acyclovir or Valleys, and all recovered fine. Of the MMR, kind of what we're thinking about, 236 got that. Only 1 got a little lymphadenopathy, a little parotiditis, recovered uneventfully. So it looked very reassuring that this vaccine probably can be given with some degree of immunosuppression. Now, the question that's probably running through your head, runs through mine as well, is what about my patient on the many biologics that we now prescribe for their Crohn's disease or rheumatoid arthritis? Can I give it to that person if they want it? And I don't know. I tend to think of transplant patients as among the more heavily immunosuppressed. So I would suspect probably could, but I don't, this study that can't answer that, but is reassuring at least. Okay, so MMR in the immunocompromised. So it appeared to be safe in this solid organ transplantation. Again, it's hard to extrapolate to persons on biologics. But if measles continues to spread, I think with some shared decision making, I don't think it's absolutely contraindicated. Yeah, they're not going to get as good a response for sure. So at the bottom of this slide, the response in parentheses is in the general population. The response to the vaccines is on the left. The rubella was fairly small number. I don't think you're going to respond better if you're immune suppressed. So the response is not going to be as good, most likely, but maybe enough to provide protection. So the question was, are they going to respond as well for people who may not have heard it? So again, maybe with some shared decision making, if the measles continues to spread. All right. So final thoughts. Vaccines have been shown to be safe and effective in preventing diseases and have eradicated one of the real scourges of humanity, smallpox. Vaccines do activate the immune system, and sometimes things go wrong when we do that. But it appears you're more likely to have those complications from actual infection than you are the vaccine. As we vaccinate for diseases associated with less morbidity and mortality, examples of this, hepatitis B in my monogamous 50-somethings, the RSV vaccine in otherwise healthy person, I think some shared decision-making is appropriate. And then live attenuated vaccines may be safe in immunocompromised persons if the measles continues to spread. And with that, I think we have plenty of time for any questions. And thank you for coming.
Thank you, Dr. Koeppe, for sharing that. I know I certainly learned a lot, especially the information about aluminum that you shared in there. I think the question that I'll lead out with, I suppose, is not as much about safety, but in general, you alluded to, and I think we've all experienced that people, there's some patients who are less likely to get additional doses of the COVID vaccine. What strategies have you found to be most successful when counseling those patients about getting subsequent doses?
Yeah, that would be the million-dollar question that if I could answer. I think kind of the only thing, and this isn't much, is just establishing trust. Occasionally patients get to the point where it's like, all right, Dr. K, I trust you. If you think I should get the vaccine, I'll get it. I think you can share evidence. I think when I've done it, I've probably come across sounding kind of arrogant, which usually just causes people to dig in their heels even more. I think that's not to mean you can't share the data and convince them, but I don't think I've had a whole lot of success at sharing data to convince patients. I wish I had a better answer.
Thanks for a great presentation, John. And very thought-provoking. I thought your slide of kind of the societal harms of the diseases that we vaccinate against, to me, was sort of triggered a lot of stuff. And Jay Bhattacharya, I don't know if you saw his editorial several months ago. So he's the new NIH director and was the one who wrote the Great Barrington Declaration in the midst of COVID and sort of an oppositional voice, or at least a sort of non-mainstream voice during the pandemic, is now in charge of the NIH. So when the administration has now pulled back on funding mRNA vaccines, and his argument for why to do that was that the mRNA vaccines had lost the trust of the public. So it wasn't that they weren't effective or whatever. So I don't want to. I mean, to me, there are a lot of flaws in his argument, but I think about, like, for example, hepatitis B. So I mean, I practiced for a long time, and I don't think I've ever seen a single case of hepatitis B that wasn't in a high-risk population. And we adopted a strategy, 30 years ago to immunize children with I think the idea of eradicating the disease. And now we have this recommendation to immunize people who I think are at exceedingly low risk. And so I wonder, like, in the vaccine community, is there discussion now about, like, at what point are we overreaching? And I also think back to the dynamics of, like, for example, smallpox. I think at the time it was like, I'm going to immunize for my own child's safety, but there was this sort of notion of we are rallying as a community to protect each other. And we've really lost that part of the argument. And I think the more we immunize against things with very low prevalence, the harder it is to make that case. And I wonder if that's not a stronger case, which is, don't if you're 18, don't get the flu for you, get it for your grandma. So I don't know. I obviously a lot of stuff in there, but I wonder your thoughts on that.
Yeah, a lot of good points raised. I think that is an argument you can make. Get the Tdap, not to protect your grandson from pertussis. Same with the RSV vaccine. Get it to protect your grandchild. And you're absolutely right. I think I don't know if it's Jonas Salk or Sabin who got a ticker tape parade in New York after the development of the polio vaccine. So there really was this, they were seen as heroes, and where we've lost that, I try to avoid politics, but yeah. I don't know what conversation is going on in the pro-vaccine community. I do personally feel the Hep B universal vaccine, we're the only reservoir for Hep B, so vaccinating children, we could potentially eradicate the disease. At the same time, my monogamous 57-year-old who doesn't work in healthcare, I feel that's overkill. That's my own take.
Yeah, any thoughts on waning of vaccine immunity? We really only have data up to maybe 50 or 50, 60-year-olds right now. Do you think maybe, I know you're just guessing, but you think maybe when these people are 70 or 75, are they going to lose their immunity by then, or who knows?
Well, yeah, so it probably differs by disease, but that's why we vaccinate against varicella, because we know that immunity wanes. I don't know on measles, mumps, rubella. I think that one is thought to be good, but certainly immunity can for sure wane, and that's the rationale behind the varicella vaccine.
Thanks for this talk. Going back to vaccine safety, the COVID-19 vaccine in young men and this concern of myocarditis, where are we in that story? And if you know.
Yeah, so the question was, where are we with the myocarditis concern in young men? And unfortunately, I'm going to punt. I don't know where we are with that. Certainly, last year there were more hospitalizations from COVID than flu, so it's still around, clearly not what it was. Most of those, no surprise, were in the elderly. So, an 18-year-old doesn't want the COVID vaccine. I don't think that's a major issue at this point. At this point, almost all of us have some degree of immunity, either from vaccines or infection or both. So I'm still recommending it. If they say no, it's kind of the end of the conversation with my patients.
Final question for today's grand rounds. I know what I have and what I conceptualize in terms of respiratory infections and how I subjectively think of what is probably higher risk for things for which we have vaccines: influenza, COVID, RSV, pneumococcal. I'd love to hear your thoughts on, if you had to prioritize those in order, which you think are actually going to be most likely to be beneficial for our patients.
That's a good question. Suppose I'd start with influenza, even though I just got through saying there were more hospitalizations from COVID last year. I feel like there's more acceptance of that. So start with the low-hanging fruit, just because we've been doing it every year. So yesterday, I had 2 or 3 patients who I offered the flu and COVID, and they said yes to flu, but no to COVID. So start with the low-hanging fruit. Then probably COVID. When I've looked at the pneumococcal data, it's not overwhelmingly positive what I could find. I mean, I think it's worth doing, but when I tried to find data on prevention with the pneumococcal vaccine, I couldn't find anything groundbreaking. And I don't have that data with me right now to share, but I remember being a little underwhelmed by the benefit of that vaccine. So I'd probably start with flu, just because it's the low-hanging fruit, then COVID, and then probably pneumococcal, and then RSV. There was finally a study. The original studies on RSV showed it worked great at preventing RSV, but there were no hospitalizations or deaths in the study. A study just came out in the New England Journal that did show it prevented hospitalization. My back of the envelope calculation was you had to vaccinate 1,800 people to prevent 1 hospitalization. So probably worth doing, but the number needed to vaccinate is pretty high, and that was to prevent hospitalization, not death.
Dr. Koeppe, thank you again very much for Grand Rounds today, and thank you everyone who joined us. And we will meet again in November.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.